All right, welcome to part two of session 5 here on your computer. We were talking about now Johnson had won his own run for the presidency, so it was now his time to propose his ideas, and one of his ideas was called the Great Society. So now, with control of Congress, Johnson in January of 1965 sends to the Hill proposals which created the Great Society. First, Johnson wanted to provide federal aid for education, which Johnson said was the key to unlocking the door of a great society, end quote. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 provided over $1 billion for textbooks, library materials, and special programs in private as well as in public schools. The ESEA also encouraged rapid desegregation, so integrating the schools. Medicare was a national health insurance for the elderly. It would be paid through the Social Security tax. The Medicaid was a program of federal grants, or Medicare, this is Medicaid. Medicaid was a program of federal grants to states to set up their own plans to help needy citizens who would not qualify for Medicare. The American Medical Association charged that these bills would lead to socialized medicine. Congress passed these measures easily. Johnson pushed Congress to pass other reforms, laws to clean up highways, polluted air and water, to improve automobile safety, and to give money to battle poverty. Congress began a program of urban renewal to get rid of urban slums, ended the quota on immigration, and set up the Department of Transportation and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So, some of the things that still affect us today, some of the things that are needing money today, Medicare, Medicaid, socialized medicine, which we get out of, I was going to say Obama created his own called Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act. So some interesting parallels you can see. You can maybe even go back to the progressives, and this is, would you think that Johnson is probably one of these progressive presidents, or would he be considered a progressive president back in the teens and the 20s? So a question for you, does Johnson's Great Society, or was Johnson's Great Society considered as important as the New Deal, and what stops Johnson from becoming the new FDR? We're going to get into that right now. Basically, what stopped Johnson from becoming the new FDR and kind of sidetracked what was happening with the Great Society is the Vietnam War. Now, let's get some background history on the Vietnam conflict and war. So in 1884, France annexes Vietnam and places it under colonial rule. By 1921, Ho Chi Minh creates the Nationalist Party, seeking independence from France. In fact, Ho Chi Minh was at Versailles in 1919, trying to push for Vietnamese independence. During World War II, Ho Chi Minh fought the Japanese, and after they surrendered, Minh started a full-scale revolt, capturing Hanoi, the capital of the territory of Vietnam. At the end of the war, France reestablished control of Vietnam, fearing that Vietnam would fall to the communists. Truman supported France putting down the communists. In 1954, a buffer zone was created between South and North Vietnam. So we have that country divided, just like Korea, just like Germany. Ho Chi Minh led the communists in the north and wanted to move to unify the country under communist control. As the war was ramping up, remember we have containment, which was the Truman Doctrine, contain communism instead of confronting it, contain it. So this was part of containment. Kennedy sends advisors to help train the South Vietnamese army to combat the North and the communist rebels in the South, known as the Viet Minh, and then they became known as the Viet Cong. Following the Kennedy assassination, Johnson was very wary in committing U.S. forces until the Gulf of Tonkin incident. North Vietnamese torpedo boats allegedly attacked U.S. destroyers within the Gulf of Tonkin, which is just right there by Vietnam. Johnson ordered immediate retaliation. Basically, when this was investigated, there was a doubt that the South or the North Vietnamese actually attacked the destroyers. Congress passes the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorizing President Johnson to wage war in Vietnam with whatever force he desired. By the end of 1964, Johnson had sent 20,000 troops already to Vietnam. We have Operation Rolling Thunder, a bombing campaign to slow the supplies from North Vietnam flowing into the rebels in South Vietnam. Problem is the operation didn't work, so they started bombing Hanoi and Haiphong. Haiphong is a port city where you have the Russians and the Chinese basically getting supplies to North Vietnam. Johnson ignored where the supplies were coming from because he did not want to confront those superpowers. He was not really willing to push it to a world war. So many times you would have these guys going to bomb these sites, and they would see all of this material on the docks, but they were not allowed to bomb it because they might kill a Soviet or a communist Chinese soldier and provoked a Third World War. So by 1965, bombing didn't work. One of the things that they did is they used helicopter-based troops to land in villages that were suspected of harboring communist supporters. They would destroy these villages, forcing the villagers that probably weren't communists to leave their homes. Basically, a conquering power that just made the people more resentful to the Americans and want to back the communists even more. You have escalation, so the war gets ramped up after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. February of 1965, 3,500 Marines are sent to Vietnam. These are the first combat troops. Basically, escalation was to show the enemy that every attack that they had would be met with increased superior American firepower. Twice in 65 and 67, Johnson figured that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong had had enough and ended the bombing of North Vietnam and offered peace talks. Both these times, peace talks were rejected. One of the things that they did to try to clear out the rebels in the jungles was seek and destroy missions. So April of 65, 20,000 troops arrive. By the end of 1965, 200,000 American troops are in South Vietnam. From 65 to 68, the Air Force bombs North Vietnam. They spray defoliants like Agent Orange, basically to kill all the foliage so they could see the trails and where these guys were hiding, to basically take away their cover. So in 1968, you have the Tet Offensive. And this is where 70,000 North Vietnamese troops and Viet Cong troops attack 30 different South Vietnamese cities. It's the first major conventional battle since the war started for the Americans and since the defeat of the French in 1954. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong hold the city of Hue for days. North Vietnam and Viet Cong commandos attacked the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. The Viet Cong reclaim areas that were cleared during search and destroy missions. Basically, the Tet Offensive as a tactical or a strategic battle was actually a loss for North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. It was an American victory, but this attack was so big, and the way it was portrayed in the media, it basically shook the United States and the people back home's ideas of what was going on. So they were taken aback by the images of American soldiers dying and getting wounded in Vietnam. So this is where you see the war kind of starting to turn. So in 1968, Johnson decides he's not going to run for re-election. Even though during the Tet Offensive they did beat back the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, the war grew to be hated. So basically Johnson decided, I'm not going to run for re-election in 1968. Johnson, vice president, decides to run, Hubert Humphrey. He is defeated by Nixon, and we have the Nixon era started in 1968. So Nixon in 68 to 1975, these are the last days of Vietnam, and basically Nixon wants the South Vietnamese to take more responsibility of the war and starts removing troops in 1969. He orders increased bombing in North Vietnam as well as in Laos and Cambodia, because they were the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong would go through those countries to get to South Vietnam. In 1970, Nixon invades Cambodia. This just increases anti-war movements. A lot of people did not want this war to go on. You'll see things, you'll read things about it. One of the incidents of this was at Kent State, where National Guard troops fire on demonstrators and kill 4 students. In 1971, the New York Times publishes the Pentagon Papers, which proved that the government had lied about the war's conduct. Also in 1971, Lieutenant William Calley massacres 100 unarmed civilians at the village of My Lai. Nixon is reelected in 72 and increases the bombing of Hanoi, but this does not break the North Vietnamese. In January of 73, the U.S. and the North Vietnamese reach an agreement to end the fighting, and basically this is where American troops start to leave. The peace treaty allowed the U.S. to pull out troops before the communists closed in. So April of 1975, North Vietnamese troops overrun South Vietnam and take the entire country. The U.S. suffers its first defeat in a war. The defeat sets off reassessments of the role of the U.S. in the world and how it should approach conflicts in the future. This is a picture of them evacuating the American embassy in Saigon as the communists are basically entering the city. So taking a look at the numbers in Vietnam, 58,174 men are killed, over 300,000 are wounded. The cost of the Vietnam War for the United States from 1950 to 1974 is $150 billion. Number of troops that were stationed in Vietnam at the peak of the war was over 500,000. The average age of a U.S. soldier killed in Vietnam was 23. Youngest was 16, oldest was 62, and the average days of combat that an infantry soldier had in 1 year in Vietnam were 240. We talk about what's going on in the world now, and you can see a lot of our troops that are currently serving are serving on 3rd, 4th, or 5th rotations in the wars currently the United States is involved in. So just think about that while you're thinking about this, studying about Vietnam. That's going to end it for this part. Get ready for part 3, which will be coming up as soon as you start it right here.